my topic tonight is growing summer veggies from seed. And you might think, well, it's, you know, it's hardly summer. It's not even spring. We're still in winter. Why are we talking about this now? Well, if you want to start growing, if you want to start to learn to grow from seed, one thing that you're going to have to be is organised. When you buy a punnet of seedlings from a nursery, there's easily 8 to 12 weeks of growth that have gone into that for you. And that's why you pay a premium for seedlings as compared to buying a pack of seed. So if you can get yourselves organised in enough time and you have the know-how and the skill to start to grow from seed, it's a wonderful thing to be able to do. It really is empowering because you start to learn to grow from seed, and then you work out how to save the right seed for the end of the at the end of the season, so that you can keep growing again and again, year after year. But that's another topic for another day. So let's have a look at if I can get my screen to behave. It was behaving 2 seconds ago. Don't you love technology? Here we are. Okay, so for example, you know, summer favourites would have to be these sorts of things. You look down the list: the tomatoes, the capsicums, zucchini, the pumpkins, beetroot, lettuce. You know, summer is the time that most people will get out into the garden. They might not be winter gardeners, but everyone loves to grow a tomato or two, and certainly lots of other things you could be growing. So tonight in this talk, what I'm going to be discussing are these sorts of things. What actually happens when a seed becomes a seedling? Because there are some steps that happen in the soil that you might not even be seeing. I'm going to look at different types of techniques. If you are already growing from seed and what you do works for you, continue to do it. But really, this is showing people who don't know or people who haven't had success what we might be doing wrong. I'm going to look at direct sowing, which talks about growing something straight into the garden, versus indirect sowing, where you nurture things in punnets or other types of media that I'll show you, and then get them to grow on for you. And seed sowing media means, well, what sort of soils do we use to grow seeds in? I'll certainly cover what you can be sowing now, and then anticipating when to sow seeds for summer itself. Because yes, we are towards the end of August, which means it's about 8 weeks towards the end of October. And that's about the time that I start to like to put lots of my summer veggies in. So great timing right now. But we will need to try and trick some of the seeds into germinating for us. And you'll see why a little bit later. Then you might have seedlings that are not ready to go on the ground. How do you look after them in the meantime? And one of those steps is called hardening off. And then I'm also going to give you references of where I might be buying seeds now if you don't live anywhere near a nursery with our 5 kilometre radius lockdown areas. So let's get into it. Now, this is just a little sketch of what happens when we go from, let me just get my pointer happening here, when we go from a seed right up to a seedling form here. So first of all, we start with a seed. That seed then develops a tiny little root that comes out of that seed, and that root's got a proper name called a radicle, and it gets longer and longer before you start to see anything above the soil. A lot of work has happened beneath the soil surface. Then once that starts to happen and we've got enough root growth, then we start to see what we call cotyledons, or baby leaves. And quite often those baby leaves don't resemble the mature plant leaves at all, which can be quite deceptive. When we've got 2 leaves, are called dicotyledons, and when we've got single leaves, it would be things like onions, we're called monocots or monocotyledons. But cotyledon in general just means the baby leaves. And then while that's happening, we get more and more root growth down below. Then we start to get the true leaves, and they're the leaves that resemble the final plant. In the meantime, the stem is thickening, and at the end over here, we've got what we call a terminal bud, where more and more growth starts to happen from here. So from start to finish, to get to this stage, it really depends on the type of seed and the time of the year. You could get from here to here in less than 2 weeks, say for a bean seed, maybe 2 to 3 weeks. But from here to here for a tomato seed might take 4 or 5 weeks. So one thing you will need to learn when we're growing from seed is patience. So to get from one stage to the other, what do we need? So to get from the seed to that root starting to grow, and there is one there in the middle. You can see that? They're pea seeds here. And you got that little root happening there. First of all, seeds can remain in packets for many months, many years in case of several seeds too. What gets them to start to grow? First of all, we need water to penetrate that seed coating and initiate germination. So water penetration into that into the seed coating. But if the temperature at which you add that water is not the right temperature, or say for example, if the moisture is in soil and the soil isn't at the right temperature, nothing is going to happen. Now, I reckon you would, if you stop to think about it in your own gardens, in 2 or 3 weeks' time, you are going to see weeds just busting out of your gardens. Like, you know, it's the start of spring. Start of spring, all these weeds come up. Now, why is that? Those seeds, weed seeds, are there lying on the soil surface, but the soil temperature isn't right. So once the sun, the rays start to penetrate the soil and warm up the soil a little bit, those weed seeds burst into action. And that's why we get lots of weeds at the start of spring, as well as, of course, there needs to be that soil moisture. So just take note of that. Nature does this quite naturally. It's when we're trying to do it artificially that we need to simulate those conditions that nature would do normally. So we need that water penetration and we need that soil temperature to be in the right range. We also need oxygen. Now, oxygen means in terms of soil, you need soil that drains well. Otherwise, if your soil is really hard and mucky, like very full of, say, a clay-based soil, if that's full of water, water has pushed the oxygen out, seeds will drown. So just keep that in mind. Your soil needs to be well draining to allow, sure, moisture to go through, but also the oxygen to be able to penetrate there. Then after that, we start to see some signs of life if you've got all of those conditions right. So to get that, for you to see things starting to happen above the soil surface, you need to have made sure that your soil didn't dry out in the meantime. So you might have sowed your seeds and then the soil dried out in the meantime, and you know, your seed has died. It may have started to germinate, but then it dies. So you need your soil media to have consistent moisture. The depth at which you sow the seeds also makes a difference too. We generally say that you sow the seed 1 to 2 times the depth of the diameter of the seed itself. So look at the size of the seed. If it's tiny seed, you don't have to push it below the soil surface very much at all. If you buried it quite deeply into the soil, we would get some action. We'd get the roots starting to grow. But then when the seed head starts to try and push its head through the soil, it's just too deep. At some point, it needs to see some sunshine in order to start to photosynthesize and create its own energy and so on. And it's not going to do that if you buried it too deeply. So just keep in mind, sometimes things go wrong simply because you've sowed the seeds too deeply. And here's a picture, very similar to the sketch there. This is a bean seed that, here we are, so we're seeing over here, this original seed head, and there's the first signs of life that I'm seeing. If I was to undo this little seed pot, I'd see lots of root growth there already. And there it is again, poking its head through the soil. Now, we need the true leaf development after we've got those those baby leaves. And here is some lettuce. You see these baby leaves? Don't look like lettuce. It was meant to be a frilly type, and here's some true leaves starting to happen there. So to get from that stage, we need sunshine. And this is really, really critical. Exposure to sunlight, gentle sunlight, so we don't want to burn these new plants that are coming up, but it's definitely needed there, again, for this photosynthesis reason. We need, again, consistent watering, making sure there's plenty of air movement around. Sometimes people's seedlings will die off because of fungal problems. The seeds were planted far too closely together, they're crowding each other out, there's no air movement, and so fungal diseases start to set in. If you're finding that is a consistent problem for you, you're not too sure why, someone once told me, and I've tried it once or twice, just to see what happens, make up a solution of chamomile tea. Make sure it's cold after you've made up the solution, and water your plants with this chamomile tea. Apparently it's meant to inhibit fungal issues where young plants just rot. So try that one. We want really strong root development, so it's a really good idea at this stage of the game to start to feed your little developing seedlings with particularly something that encourages root development, and that'll be something like sea salt, just a very weak solution, and that helps to promote root growth for a much stronger seedling. And then we get the true leaves starting to happen, and just move that. And here is a little pot of the bean seed that I showed you a little bit before, and certainly lots of true leaves happening there. And this was planted on the 8th of August. So we can also say the 27th, about 2 weeks ago. So to get to that stage, again, we need the sunlight. Again, we need some light feeding for better, good root development. And then if you'd had it originally in a punnet, you might find that all of these seedlings are a little bit too close together. And they're all going to crowd each other out and start competing. So you've got to do this thing called thinning out. And that means, for example, a standard sized punnet, you'd expect perhaps 8 lettuce seedlings in this case to be in there. So if I've got too many lettuce seedlings, those delicate little root systems are going to be competing with each other. So I need to thin some of them out, basically get rid of some of them. Best way of doing this, so as not to disturb the roots of the neighbours of your little seedlings that you're going to get rid of, is just to cut them at the base rather than trying to pull them out. If you were to try and keep them all, you'd have to try and very gently separate them so that the root systems don't knock each other out. Now, some plants take better to transplanting than others, and so I'm going to talk about how to plant seeds where they don't like to be transplanted. Lettuces don't mind it too much, and nor do tomatoes, so you can put them into punnets and pull them apart, and they don't suffer too much transplant shock. Pricking out refers to moving them on. So if I was to keep these seedlings in a pot like a punnet like that, they would certainly become very congested very quickly. But if I'm not ready, or my soil's not ready, or I've still got other things in the garden, I'm not ready to put them in yet, I might consider potting them up individually into other small pots, just to let them grow on a little bit before I'm ready to put them into their final spot. And that's called pricking out, just trying to move them from this pot to another one. And then depending on the type of plants that you're going to put in, for example, later on when we look at growing summer ones, and you've been looking after them in great condition up until they're ready to go in the soil, you need to do this thing called hardening them off, or gradually exposing them to nighttime cold temperatures before you put them into the soil. Because if you put them into the soil and nighttime temperatures are cold, they get too much of a shock. So it's really taking them from the nursery where you've got them into high school with a little few steps in the way, just to make sure that they're ready to face the big wide world in your garden. So these are just the steps, and keeping these sorts of conditions in mind, now I'm going to talk about getting your seeds to germinate. I'm always fascinated though whenever I look at the root development, which you often don't see, but just how much there is there compared to how much leaf that you're seeing. Those roots really are both the anchor and the feeding system for your plants. So I just love taking photos of plant roots. Okay, so to get your seeds to happen well, these are 3 conditions. You need the moisture, you need the right soil temperature, you need sunshine. So in terms of moisture, here is a tip. Always start with soil that has been moistened, whether it's your potting mix or seed raising mix, whatever it is, or in the ground. Make sure it's pre-moistened. And then don't allow it to ever dry out until you see germination happening, except for, now, some large seeds may rot for you if you keep watering them. So these large seeds include beans, peas, snow peas, for example, sunflowers, sweet corn. These are the large seeds, are nice and big and easy to handle. If you were to consistently keep watering them, often they will rot before they germinate. Keep it in mind. Your smaller seeds, definitely make sure your soil stays moist until you see signs of germination. But the larger seeds, sow them into moistened soil, but don't keep watering them until you see signs of life. I planted just 8 seeds, different seeds of beans the other day, and I deliberately kept watering some, and sure enough, they rotted compared to the ones that I didn't. They germinated fine. Now, soil temperature. How do you manipulate that? Well, first of all, make sure that you sow according to what your soil temperature is like. So if you're going to be sowing directly into the ground, you've got to make sure that your soil temperature is at the right season. And we'll talk about which ones are and aren't a little bit later. But if you're going to grow things that are going to grow for you over summer, you need warmth in order to germinate those vegetable seeds. They will not germinate for you otherwise. What would happen instead is the seeds would just stay in your soil and just gradually rot because there's moisture, but there's not that temperature to initiate that germination to happen. And that's why, for example, you might have tomato seedlings that come up after you've spread compost around, but they won't come up until the soil temperature is right for those tomato seeds to germinate. Sometimes people say they'd like to leave their basil to self-seed in the garden. So at the end of summer, they've let their basil go to seed. It drops its seed, but you'll never get that basil come up again in summertime, because in the meantime, in winter, it's been sitting on wet soil and it just rots the seed instead. Last thing, sunshine. Seeds don't need sunshine to germinate, okay? Remembering they're usually in some sort of soil. They don't see the sunshine. But once the seedlings start to emerge, they do need that direct sunlight. It doesn't have to be all day, but they do need some direct sunlight in order for photosynthesis to start to happen. So those 3 things: moisture, soil temperature, and sunshine. How do we get it all? So I'm going to look at different seed sowing techniques here. And that creepy looking picture on the left there, that is probably either a zucchini, but possibly a pumpkin seed there too. So even before those true leaves, those baby leaves start to come out, look at the root system that has developed there. It's wonderful stuff. So I'm going to be looking at tonight direct sowing, how to go about doing it, and which seeds are best for direct sowing. And then indirect sowing, where you look after them in a nursery type situation, whether it be in punnets or any other soil media I'm going to show you. And then best type of soil media that I find works really well. All right, so the easiest seeds to grow or to sow are the ones that go directly into the garden, or if you're not planting garden, into your pots, the final pots. So once they're in there, you don't have to move them, they just grow from there. And large seeds are good for that because they're easier to handle. And because they're large, you can plant them a little way down, say those broad bean seeds on the left there, maybe 2 to 3 centimetres down, and the pea seeds a little bit more shallow than that, possibly 2 centimetres under the soil. You just lay them out on the soil according to spacing, for those probably about 10 centimetres apart, and then push them under and leave them to be. Now remember, these bean seeds, these sorts of large seeds, sow in moistened soil, but don't keep watering. Wait till they come up for you first. And corn is the same sort of thing too. Large seed and easy to sow. Now, some people will suggest for these large seeds, you could, for an hour or so, or even the night before, put the seeds that you are going to sow just in a glass of water. That starts the swelling of the seed coating process, softens that seed coating so that germination happens more quickly. You can do that. I haven't noticed a marked difference with doing that, and I find it actually easier to oh, excuse that. Sorry. Did someone get the phone? Apologies. I was expecting the dog to come in, not the phone to me. Okay, so where was I? So with these large seeds, I find it easier to sow them if they're dry rather than wet anyway. But large seeds, as long as the soil temperature is right, they can go directly in. You don't have to do several steps along the way. Root vegetables are also best to sow directly. Even if the seeds are small, difficult to handle, it's best to sow them directly, because of the fact that if you were to put, say, radishes in a punnet, or carrots in a punnet, or parsnips, any of those sorts of things, grow them in punnets, and then you go to transplant them, by pulling apart those seedlings to put in the soil, you're damaging the root. And the root is the part of the part of the plant that you're going to eat. And so a lot of people say, oh, I'm growing carrots, but they're all funny shapes, or, they've got little arms and legs. And I'll ask, well, how did you plant them? And they said, well, I bought a punnet of seedlings. And I said, that's the problem. By separating all of those seedlings into individual plants and planting them, you've damaged the roots. So root vegetables, it's pretty important to put them directly into the soil, as long as the soil temperature is right, and then they'll come up. Germinating is not difficult, but because they are small seeds, they will, and you're sowing them very close to the soil surface. Remember, you're only planting them 1 to 2 times the soil deep as the size of the seed itself. So they're pretty shallow on the soil surface. So what happens is that the soil might dry out. They might be in the process of trying to germinate, and then the soil dries out, and you've killed your seeds. So some tips on root vegetables on how to make sure the soil remains moist when you're planting them is what I like to do: moisten soil, sprinkle the seeds over the soil, lightly cover, and perhaps not even cover. I just then go with a watering can and water it, and you'll find that those seeds tend to fall within the cracks and crevices of the soil surface itself. And then to stop them drying out, I've got a plank of wood, and it's just an old timber fence paling, and I'll put that over the seeds. Every few days I lift that off. The soil under there has remained moist because it's been shaded, but I lift it off and see if there's any signs of germination. If there is, then off comes that timber plank, and up come those seedlings all by themselves. So that's one way of getting your smaller seeds, preventing them from drying out. Your larger seeds are pushed below the soil surface. They won't dry out as quickly. Now, this one here that I'm showing, this little picture here, that's a beetroot seedling. So beetroots, if you ever see the seeds of those, the casing is really quite corky. And that is, within that corky exterior, there's, in this case, looks like 4 seedlings, or 4 tinier seeds within that corky exterior. So this is beetroot that was planted, and up came 4 individual little beetroot seedlings. At this stage, I would have to lift them very gently, separate them, and then replant them, because otherwise they'll all be competing with each other and you'd get funny shaped beetroot. So keep that in mind with beetroot. You're going to get more than one seedling coming out of each seed casing. So the type of soil that we'd want for direct sowing is this. We want it to be loose. That is light and fluffy. Friable, and that's what friable means, easy to manipulate. It needs to be moistened before we start. It needs to be well drained. If it's not well drained, it means that any water that you put on there fills up the holes within the soil particles, and so your seed will drown. There's no oxygen in that soil for the seed to access. And you've got to be sowing within the right temperature range as well. Because you can't really manipulate that soil temperature if it's outside, and not easily anyway. And so you've got to be planting at the right time. Now, I do tend to sow my root vegetables direct. Some other things that could be direct, such as the large seeds of zucchini and pumpkin, for example, they're very easy to manipulate, to hold. I tend to do what we call indirect sowing. And the main reason I do this, well, there's a couple of main reasons. First of all, if I want to get the plant started before the soil temperature is right, I need to start them off beforehand. But the second one is I want to keep track of how the sowing is happening. I have a big problem in my garden with mice eating seeds. So if I can grow them on a little bit and then put them in the soil, I find it's much easier. Well, just keep track, and also to make sure that they don't get eaten before they germinate. And I'll show you how that's done. So this is called indirect sowing, and it could be a 2-step process, could even be a 3-step process too. If there's one thing that most of us have at the time is time, so it's probably a great chance now to get into doing some of this. So for seeds growing out of season, or seeds that can get lost in the soil, whether because they're really small or because you might have mice that come along and eat them before they get a chance to germinate. So let's have a look at some of these methods. You might think straight away, okay, punnets, we need some punnets. Well, you can use punnets, definitely. First of all, though, if you're going to use any plastic pots or punnets, make sure that they're really clean. So I give them a good scrub with a brush in just hot soapy water, and then I will dunk them into just a weak bleach solution. So just get some White King or something, a few drops of that into a bucket of water, and dunk the cleaned pots into there, just to make sure that if there's any, nasties lurking where I haven't washed properly, that they get killed off. Just to make sure everything's nice and hygienic to start with. So what do we put in those though? Well, we need loose, friable, moist, well draining, and I'm going to call it media now, but another word for media is just soil, into sterile pots. So you might think, well, do I go and get some seed raising mix for this? And for several years, I suppose, when I first started, I always used seed raising mix because that's what I was doing. I was raising seeds, so get the seed raising mix. It is loose and friable. You can moisten it, of course, but what I had trouble with is, sure, the seeds would germinate, but then they did nothing. They would sit there for weeks and weeks and weeks and just not grow. So I stopped using it. And in fact, now and again, when I stopped using it, I went and had a read on the packet. Now, who ever reads the side of your potting mix packet? I bet you no one ever does. But if you read the side of the seed raising mix packet, it tells you that once the seeds have germinated, you have to move them from that and put them into something else, because seed raising mix contains no nutrition at all. There's no fertilizer in there or anything. It's just the medium in order for the seeds to germinate, and that's all. So the emerging seedlings have to be potted up, otherwise they just won't continue to grow. So I stopped using seed raising mix, and instead, if I'm going to put things in punnets or pots, I just use potting mix. A decent quality potting mix, because a decent quality will have fertilizer within it. It'll have water retaining crystals and so on. It just gives the seeds a much better chance to grow on from their baby state. The problem is with potting mix though, there are large chunks in it. You might need to sift them out, or I just pick them out if they're there. Because otherwise, if you're growing a seed on top of a large chunk of potting mix, it's got nowhere for the roots to take hold. But otherwise, just use potting mix. You could also use garden soil. And I discovered this when I visited my aunt, and she was in Italy, and I was asking her, she almost operates a market garden, but I asked her, what do you use for potting mix, for seed raising mix? She said, well, what do you mean? So, well, how do you grow your seeds? Because she grew everything from seed. And she said, no, I just get soil, and she puts them in small punnets like this, and then grows them. And I thought, well, no, you're not meant to put garden soil in pots, because the structure of the soil collapses when it's in a pot. The lovely oxygen pockets within the soil collapses. But you know, for the 4 or 5 weeks that you need to grow your seedlings before you put them in the ground, that actually works okay. So when I came back to Australia and I tried it, and what I found was that, sure, the seeds germinated fine, but so did a whole lot of little weeds that came up. So in the garden soil that I had, there must have been weed seeds just sitting there waiting to germinate. They came up. So what I did after that, if I wanted to use garden soil, I want to get rid of those weed seeds. So what I do is I'll put some in an old container, say like an ice cream container, and then I sterilize that soil. And it's easier than you think. If you have a microwave oven, you can sterilize the soil in the microwave. So say for, you know, half a litre to a litre of soil, maybe zap it for a minute, and that gets rid of any of those weed seeds that are in there. So you have a sterile soil once again, and use that as a potting mix just for short-term use, just to get your seeds started. So if you can't get to a nursery right now, you might try that. Now you've got to have decent garden soil though, not the clay patch at the bottom of the garden or something. So perhaps, you know, where you already grow your veggies, use some of the soil from that. So punnets is your standard way of doing things. Before I go on to different ways of doing it, I'm just going to give you a little tip on how to pick up and sow tiny seeds into a punnet. And this is a video, so I'm just going to get this to work, hopefully. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. So there I've got potting mix in a sterilised punnet. Fill it up, and then I tap it down just to settle it a little bit, because you find otherwise when you water it, it settles too much. So tap it down to settle it. And here I've got lettuce seedlings. Now lettuce seeds, the seeds are tiny. They're very difficult to pick up. So I've got a skewer, I wetted the skewer, and now I'm just wiping the seeds off the skewer onto the soil surface at about, I'm thinking 8 to 10 spots. Now some have dropped over there, so I might need to thin them out later on. And now I'm going to water them just very gently. You may have a spray bottle. This is a bottle top waterer that I use, very gentle. But I'm still seeing the seeds poking at the top. So here I'm now going to use the blunt end of the skewer just to push them down a little bit. If there's any big lumps of potting mix, get rid of those. And there it is, dripping away. Make sure you label with the seed variety and the date that you sowed them. We don't want the soil to dry out, so you could put them in a plastic bag so they don't dry out until you see it germinating. Once you see any signs of germination, we need to get rid of this plastic bag. That plastic bag just keeps the moisture in there. If they've germinated and there's consistent moisture, they are going to rot. So as soon as you see them start to germinate, take them out of, this is a Ziploc bag, take them out of this bag. And I think that was sown on the 8th, and I took a photo of them today. There they are now. So if you can look very carefully, these are still just the baby leaves of these lettuces. And in the middle, very, very faint, very tiny, they're the true leaves starting to happen. Now this is after 18 days. So that's what I mean by patience. You don't sow them today and expect to be eating a salad tomorrow. And they're still far too small to take out of here and put them into my prepared pots or garden beds. I need to wait until those adult leaves have started to grow, and I get at least 2 sets of those adult leaves, not just one, at least 2. That'll tell me that the root system is well developed enough to be able to cope with grown-up conditions. So I've showed you just standard punnets. If you can ever get your hands on these punnets with individual cells, they're fantastic because you don't need to be doing much thinning out. You can just take out each pocket of soil and then plant it. So there's far less root damage when you're trying to separate seedlings from each other. You just might note here, I'm planting 2 seeds in the same spot. That's because I'm a bit dubious about how well they would germinate. So I'll often plant 2 seeds in the one spot as insurance, so that at least one will grow. If they've both grown, I will probably need to cull one if I can't separate them properly. So if you can ever get your hands on punnets that have got individual cells, hang on to them. They're really good to use. If you want to go into seed sowing in a big way, you might set up what I call a seed bed, and this is just a cut down polystyrene box, so it's not terribly deep, doesn't need to be terribly deep. And rather than fill it up with potting mix or anything else, I make up a mix. Let's see if I've got it. Yeah, the mix is 1 part of compost from my own compost bins, so finished compost, 1 part coir. Now coir is just coconut fibre, which you normally buy in a small brick, and then you put it in water and it all comes apart. And that helps to keep the compost nice and friable. Remember that word friable. We don't want things compacting and blocking out all of the oxygen, and that's what the coir does, as does some propagating sand as well. This system like this, I would be planting seeds in a row. So there's a label there at the end, and I'd be planting the seeds in a row. And when they get to a decent size, then I would be taking them out and potting them up separately. But this is one way of just using standard seed bed to grow lots and lots of things. And it's reusable too, because you're taking out each individual seedling and potting it on. So it's handy to have something like that if you want to get into it into a big way. It's very difficult though to manage the soil temperature of this. So you would be sowing seeds in here that are that need current soil temperatures, not warmer, for example. And here is looking at it side on, and I would be taking out individual seedlings and potting them up or putting them into the garden. Some of you may have done sort of little experiments like this, particularly with kids. It's good to do it. You know, you get yourself an old egg carton and you put some potting mix in each of those individual cells and you start to grow things on. Now, the point of this is that once they're growing, you can split those individual cells apart, particularly if they're wet, they'll cut up very easily, and you can plant the whole thing into the garden. So we're talking about biodegradable pots. So a lot of people would advocate doing this. I don't like it that much. It's fun to do with kids, yeah, but what I don't like about it is that there's not much soil there, and that's not so much the issue. It's more the fact that the cardboard that this is made out of will soak up the water. So you might be watering your plants, but the cardboard takes on that water, and these dry out very quickly if you're not careful. So just a word of warning, sure, get your seeds raised in there, but make sure perhaps that this is sitting, the whole thing is sitting perhaps in a tray of water at the base, so that the water isn't wicked away from the soil but stays with the soil and not the egg carton instead. There are other better biodegradable pots that I'm going to show you, and you probably might be able to start collecting some of these. I often use toilet rolls, empty toilet rolls for seed sowing. They're useful for individual large seeds. For example, I wouldn't be putting in lettuce seeds in these sorts of things, but large seeds such as sunflower seeds or beans, for example, an easy way of filling them is to get yourself an old milk carton, cut it down, and so that the handle and the spout is being used as a funnel. They fit perfectly well in the toilet rolls that I use anyway. Generally they do. And then put your seed raising mix or your potting mix in through the top, and it works really well. Note that I don't staple the bottom or tuck under some cardboard at the bottom. I just make sure that they're all standing upright in some sort of container, and you'll find that later on what the seeds, the roots of this emerging seedling will hold that soil in for you. So you can lift the whole thing up once it's growing and the soil doesn't fall out, which I think is amazing. The roots hold that there for you. And here is some where I've got, they look like beans. Yeah, they'd be bean seeds there too. So a whole lot of them there happening. I've got peas growing in this one here. So look, beans and peas are things that can grow directly in the ground. They're large, they're easy to handle. But remember, I have that problem with mice coming and eating the seeds before they germinate. So if I get them to this stage, then I plant the whole toilet roll in the ground as it is, and it will rot away quite nicely. But these are quite narrow. If you wanted to grow things in pots that are a little bit larger, you might consider making these newspaper pots. So I would use them for individual larger seeds, for example, coming on to zucchini and pumpkin, cucumber, a little bit larger. They grow very quickly, so they need a decent amount of soil in the root ball to do that. I'll also use these biodegradable newspaper pots for clumping plants. Now, in the vegetable kingdom, the clumping plants for me are things that if you were to look at their stems, you've just got individual stems, but not much at the top. So over winter, a clumping plant might be coriander. Over summer, or coriander or rocket. You don't tend to sow an individual seed of rocket. You'd be growing several, and they grow in a clump, as is coriander. In summer, it would be basil. Basil grows really well in a clump, not individual plants on their own. I also make these if I need to pot up small seedlings into something larger before they're ready to go into the ground. So as an alternative to a small plastic pot, you might run out of them, you might consider making some of these. And yes, I've got another video here to show you how to make them. Now this video is also on YouTube at My Green Garden, that's my channel, but otherwise also on my website if you don't catch it all now. But I'll just run you through. You need newspaper. And you also need a straight-sided jar, not one that sort of tapers in or out, just a straight-sided one. So open up the sheet of newspaper and just single one and have it facing you as if you were reading it. Now for a smaller sized pot, we fold it in half and then we fold it in half all over again. So you've got one long strip. And then turn that around so that the narrow end is closest to you. And we get the jar and place it about 1/2 to 2/3 away along, making sure the open part of the jar is facing in towards the newspaper. And roll it firmly, but not too tightly, right to the very end. And then you've got a big hole in the middle. That's going to become the base of your pot. So push in that newspaper right into the base there, and then slip off your glass jar. But if you were to look in there, you can see it's all sticking up. So now we get the firm part of the jar and put it back in there and just push down to roll it around a little bit, and that'll flatten the surface for you quite nicely. And there's your pot, and your pot's ready. Now, I've made a million of these, but if you find yours is a bit wonky, just push in the base a little bit and that'll make it nice and firm. Now, if you want to make a jar that's a little bit taller, rather than fold it into 4, you fold it into 3. Same thing all over again. Roll your jar, push in the base, slip it off, crimp the bottom of it, and there's your pot. And you can see the difference in sizes between the two of them. So the one on the left I use for starting seeds. The one on the right might be for potting some up. And if you've got nothing to do over the next few days while you're waiting for your seeds or whatever, start getting some of these ready so that when you're ready to pot up, they're there ready for you. Hopefully you've got access to newspapers too. Not everyone gets newspapers anymore. Right, so in these newspaper pots, I put in things that later on I can just put straight into the ground. So there's no transplant shock involved here at all. And there I've got basil growing. So you notice there's quite a few basil seeds growing in the same pot. And I wouldn't necessarily thin them out. Basil does fine in a clump like that. If I had that, for example, with, you know, on the left here, about 5 or 6, to say they were tomato plants, I would definitely not be able to keep 5 or 6. You'd just be keeping to 1. And then we plant the whole thing in the ground. You'll find that the top of the newspaper stays there above the ground, but the rest has all rotted away very quickly. No transplant shock for the plant's roots. Here's another one, which you may not be familiar with. And here I've made little blocks of soil to raise seeds. And this is using what's called a soil blocking tool. So the mix that I've got in here is compost that I've sifted though to make sure that I don't have any lumps of compost in there. Again, that coir peat and worm castings. So this is going to be a lovely, rich mix. The coir helps to hold it together as well as providing that oxygen for it. How do I make these sorts of things? I'll show you in a sec. But there are individual little, again, here we've got basil seedlings growing. So each of these little soil blocks, we pop the seeds in the middle and up come the little seedlings. And then we just pick that up and pop it straight into the soil once your soil is ready. So this is the tool, and the one I've got is called Ladbroke soil blocking tool. So looking at it from the bottom up, there's 5 compartments. There are different sizes. So this is probably the most useful one. There are ones with larger ones for larger seeds, but that's that one. So what we do is we get this, you've got a tray with that mix that I mentioned before, the coir, the worm castings and the compost, and put it, mix it all together, put it into a tray, and then you push this down into that soil and sort of play with it a little bit to make sure it's nice and compact. And then using this thing here, you push it down and out come 5 blocks at a time. Handy, very, very handy. And once you've got the tool, as long as you've got a compost bin and a worm farm, you can be easily making lots and lots of little seedling blocks for yourself. Now, Jiffy pellets. If you've ever been to any of my talks, you probably will be familiar with these Jiffy pellets. This is a type of soil block, but you buy them as compressed ones, which then once you put them into water, they swell up. Probably 5 to 7 centimetres high, I'd say, would be the height of them. Very, very convenient, and I use these a lot. The soil blocks from before are probably better environmentally than these ones. These are very convenient, but the soil is held in here by this outside membrane, which is not biodegradable. The soil roots will grow through this and you plant it, and that's fine. But at the end of the season, when you go to pull them out, you're going to find this membrane still there. So it is plastic based. Whereas the one before, the soil block, no, there's no outside to it as such. But I do find these Jiffy pellets really, really handy. So here is probably zucchini in this case, pushing through, and you can already see the roots starting to come through. I don't tend to do zucchini or cucumbers or anything in these because they just grow so quickly. I would put zucchini, cucumbers and pumpkins straight into one of my biodegradable newspaper pots just with some potting mix in there, because they grow really quickly, really fast, and these Jiffy pellets don't help them that way. So I do those for tomatoes, which I'll show you in a sec. But if you're wondering what you could be sowing right now, I'm going to show you, and then we're going to talk about ones that are soil temperature dependent. So right now in Melbourne, we do have cool soil temperature. It certainly hasn't warmed up yet. So we're looking for cool season plants that can grow from here on in. So in terms of cool season plants, direct into the soil right now, you could be planting beetroot. That'd be good. Snow peas can go in, and they can go in right up until October. Beetroot can go right over summer, but you can get it started now. Radishes pretty much all year round, except for when it's really cold in winter. Parsnip can be going in now. Carrots I'd probably wait next month. Let the soil warm up just a little bit. They're the ones go direct into the soil. Notice that they're large or they are root vegetables. To grow indirectly, if you wanted to start off now, lettuce, I'd be starting them off in punnets. Spring onions in punnets again, you could be growing those now. Leeks in punnets. Now, spring onions and leeks do not suffer transplant shock, so you can sow them quite thickly inside your punnet and then transplant them when they're a little bit bigger. Silver beet in punnets, they can be sown now. And sunflowers, you can start sunflowers now. I'd start them in toilet rolls though. They're large seeds, you're planting them individually. If you've got toilet rolls, yep, start your sunflowers in there. If you're to do sunflowers in punnets, they grow quite quickly and they don't like that transplant shock. Now, warm season plants that we can get started now will need warm soil, and I'm going to show you how that happens. But they are all going to be grown in directly because we can't put them in the soil now. The soil's not warm enough out in the garden. Tomatoes, eggplant, capsicum, chilies, eggplants twice. I really like eggplant, obviously. I would start now by seed up until late September. It's still plenty of time to get them in by seed. Other warm season plants, I would be starting them a little bit later, and that's your zucchini, pumpkin, any of the cucurbit family, zucchini, pumpkin, and cucumbers, because they just grow very, very quickly. And if you were to start them now by seed, they'd be enormous and they'd be wanting to go into the ground. So wait till a little bit later for those ones. So how do we get that warm soil when it's not warm? Well, we have to fool the seeds into thinking it's summer. So we have to create warm soil for them. We're getting a head start on summer by doing this. You can, if you are really keen on growing seeds, I would heartily recommend getting yourself a heat bed. It's like a little electric blanket for your soil. Here I've got Jiffy pellets, but we have punnets sitting in here as well. We need that soil to be consistently warm, not warm during the day and cold at night. That'll work, but it'll take a lot longer. We need that soil to stay consistently at the right temperature in order for these seeds to germinate. And these work really, really well. The one on the left I bought possibly easily 10 years ago, and it probably set me back about $130. But when I stopped to think of how many thousands of seeds I've used, and they don't draw too much current either, so it's not a huge electricity bill or anything. It saved me a fortune on buying seedlings, definitely. Or here is one that's just a mat. Now, I saw this at a nursery at Bulleen Art and Garden. It cost about $30. I haven't tried it, but I'm sure it just needs to provide that bottom heat. If you don't want to go to that expense, you might be able to do it yourself by finding somewhere that's consistently warm within your house. And the warm spots could be, for example, on the top of your fridge. If you touch the base of the top of your fridge, you'll notice usually it's just a few degrees warmer than room temperature. And sometimes that's all it takes. We just need that soil to be slightly warmer than room temperature. Say, for example, tomatoes, it's about 20 degrees Celsius, consistently that. Now, unless you're going to leave your heater on day and night, which I wouldn't recommend, you know, that soil is not going to be that temperature. But at the top of the fridge, it might be. So I would sow them in punnets or in a Jiffy pellets and sit them on the top of the fridge. Notice I've got a plastic bag around it. That's, remember to try and make sure that the seed raising media doesn't dry out in the meantime. If you are a keen composter though, you can create somewhere warm. And I've done this many, many times. So this is looking into my compost bin. It's obviously not full, but what I do is I will add something to that compost to get it really hot. And it could be something as simple as, remember the days we used to go to cafes, a bag of coffee grounds. The cafes are still open. Next time you visit one, ask them if they've got a bag of coffee grounds they want to get rid of. They've got bags and bags at the end of every day. Mix that into your compost contents. That wakes up the bacteria that's in your compost, the good bacteria, and that bacteria starts to generate a lot of heat. So I've got my seedlings sitting inside strawberry punnets. Strawberry punnets make beautiful little mini greenhouses. And then I've warmed up the base. I sit them on there, and then I put the lid over the top of the compost. So it's just to keep the warmth in there. But I do need to, every day or so, go and check if they've germinated, because as soon as they've germinated, they need to come out of there. Remember, what they need, what seeds need after germination is access to direct sunlight. If you don't give them that, then they start to become very elongated, and I'll show you in a sec what that looks like. So you might have, top of the fridge, you might have a compost that you can heat up. You might find other places in your house. Some people say, well, a sunny window, but you know, your window is not going to stay sunny all day long. So you have to find something that's consistently warm. So as soon as a germination occurs, and in my little mini greenhouse, the one that's got the thermostat control, they came up after 3 days. These are tomato seeds that have come up here. So that's I mean, that's so exciting. I'm just so excited when I see seeds coming through it. You know how many thousands I've sown in my lifetime. I still gives me a thrill. There they are. So as soon as germination occurs, you have to move them into a sheltered outdoor position. I might sit them in punnets or something like that, but they've got to be outdoors. Mine get morning sunshine, not all day sunshine, but they do get some sunshine there. And it's got to be sheltered. So I don't have that sitting out in the rain or anything. If you don't have them getting sunshine, this is what happens to them. They will start to elongate and reach towards where there is sun. And I've often do consultancies at people's houses, and they show me their seeds, and they show me ones that have got really long stems, and I think that's great. It's not actually. Those stems are really quite weak. We want leaf growth to be happening shorter down the stem itself, like a little bit like this one here, not big and long like this. They're just not going to be terribly strong. So that's why they need to see sunshine as soon as they start to germinate. So this is my sheltered outdoor position, and this is just something I bought online. Cost me about $35 or something, and it's a mini greenhouse. It's not anything I can walk into. I don't need it to be that big, but it has shelves, and importantly, it's got a clear plastic cover which I can zip up and down. So during the day, particularly if it's a nice day, I will unzip the front panel, and so they get exposure to air and to sunshine, but I do make sure that I close it again at night time so that they don't get too cold. So drop the covers at night time, or if you can't do that, bring them inside. And to sustain growth and get them growing and moving nicely for you, a wheat liquid feed when I feed them, when I water them. Something like sea salt, a watered down sea salt, perhaps some watered down worm juice. Don't make it strong. These are still little babies. And just like you wouldn't feed a human baby with full-on strength human food, we're not going to do that for plants either. So make sure it's diluted. Otherwise, their root systems can't take it to be too strong. When the real leaves appear, then I have to pot up these because I'm getting real leaves starting to appear up here, but I'm not ready to put them in the garden. The garden soil is too cold still. So I have to keep them growing until the soil temperature is at the right temperature for me. So I'll pot them up, because notice I've got roots growing here. They want to grow into something. I'm going to have to put them into a larger pot. It doesn't have to be big. It could be just one of my newspaper pots, and there they are there. So if I didn't start them off into this newspaper pot, I started them off into Jiffy pellets, then I've moved the whole Jiffy pellet into a pot, and I've put potting mix or even just compost around it. And if I've got more than one plant growing, they start to grow true leaves. That's when I'll also thin to a single seedling. I only want one tomato plant to be growing in each of these pots. So ongoing care, because my tomatoes, for example, aren't going to go into the ground until the end of October. That's usually in my garden when the soil is warm enough. Usually you put your hand on top of the soil and it stays consistently warm. That's fine. You can also buy soil thermometers, but for me, general rule of thumb is towards the end of October in my own garden. So those plants are going to start to get bigger. You might need to pot them up all over again. Have a look at them there. They are definitely ready to go in the ground, but the ground's not ready to take them. It doesn't matter for tomatoes. They don't mind being root bound. They don't mind continuing to grow there, but just make sure you feed them every now and again. It's a good idea too, just a little tip for tomatoes or any other plants that are going to grow flowers before they grow their vegetables or their fruit for you, is to give them a pinch or water a little bit of potash in there, because that'll start their flowering, and that's fine, because as soon if they're flowering when they're in pots, they'll continue to flower once they're in the ground. If you do need to pot them up a little bit again, with tomatoes, you can pot them so that the stem is pretty much covered, and all those little hairs that are on the stem of the tomato plant, they develop into roots. So they don't mind being buried a little bit there too. Before they're ready to go in the ground, those lovely seedlings might still be a little bit tender. So I make sure they're out of my greenhouse. They start getting exposed to the nighttime temperatures. Tomatoes don't like nighttime temperatures below 10 degrees. And that's sometimes an indication of when to start putting them in the ground, when nighttime temperatures are consistently above 10 degrees Celsius. You might get one or two odd nights when it's cold, but otherwise, at the moment, nighttime temperatures are consistently below 10 degrees. So we certainly wouldn't be putting them in now. They'll just sit there. And plants that aren't actively growing are plants that are more prone to insect attack. Here's a pinch of potash fertilizer to promote flowering before planting, as I mentioned before. And if you've got them there, but you don't think the soil's warm enough, make sure your garden bed is ready for them. And that's a whole topic for another night, but you've got to make sure your garden bed is ready so that you can pop them in straight away. So other summer veggies by seed, how I would do it and when I would do it. So basil, I would either make newspaper pots or soil blocks for them. And I won't start them from now. Honestly, basil is quick to germinate if it has some heat, but they take ages until the daytime temperatures are good for basil. They just don't grow. So I wouldn't start them until, say, the start of November. Often people like to, for example, go to the nursery and buy their tomatoes and buy their basil seedlings at the same time. And the tomatoes might take off because they don't need a soil temperature as much as basil, but basil sit there and languish and just do nothing. And along come the snails and slugs and eat them instead. So basil can go into the ground a little bit later once it's nice and warm, but you can get them started from about November. Cucumber, another summer veggie, either in a large Jiffy pellet or preferably in newspaper pots or the soil blocks from late October. They do prefer some base heat in order to get them going. If you're going to put them directly in the ground, I would wait until November. So the soil needs to be nice and warm if you're going to direct sow them. But if you're going to indirect from late October, and that goes for pumpkins as well. So pumpkins either direct in the ground, they're quite large seeds, or you might try the newspaper pots or even toilet rolls for these too. You could do these. Soil blocks, unless you've got a large soil blocking tool, pumpkin seeds just grow too big too quickly. So newspaper pots or toilet rolls are good. If it's direct in the soil, from late November, but if you're going to start them earlier, from late October. And a warm start is preferred. Carrots grow well over summer, but carrots are a root vegetable, so direct into the soil. Not just yet, just wait until about mid-September. So mid-September to sort of late April is a time for sowing and growing carrots. Beans, they can be grown directly from late September. Now, if your beans if you have issues like I do, what mice are eating the bean seeds, then I use toilet rolls to germinate. And it doesn't even have to be a whole toilet roll. You can just cut them in halves and just do half toilet rolls, germinate them that way. That's an easy enough way to do it. And then just transplant the whole toilet roll into the ground from late September. Beans for me is around about grand final day, whenever that might be this year, who knows, but usually it's late September. Grand final day, I think, time to plant my beans. Zucchini, same as for pumpkin. And sweet corn, it can be grown direct. You can sow direct, but again, if you have problems, I would be putting it in. I'd be putting in toilet rolls for the sweet corn. Yep, and from November onwards. So some of them don't need, carrots and beans, for example, don't need the warm soil to start. The other ones do prefer to have the warm soil in order to get that germination happening. Now, you might have seeds left over from last year and you're wondering, are they still viable? That is, am I going to plant them and will they grow? Presuming you do everything else correctly, you're not sort of planting them too deeply or anything. There is a way of checking if they're still viable without actually planting them. And you can test them prior. So remember, the conditions they need is moisture and the correct temperature in order to germinate. They don't necessarily need soil, but they do need the correct temperature with that moisture. So what I do is I'll get an old takeaway food container, something that I can close up basically nice and tightly, and I will moisten some paper towel, and I'll put the seeds in between 2 layers of moistened paper towel and then put the lid back on. Now this is mesclun lettuce. I've labelled it, and also label when you planted it too, because you want to make sure it doesn't take too long to germinate. Now lettuce prefers cool, so I don't need to add any heat, but if I was trying to try out tomato seeds this way, I would need some heat on the base of those tomato seeds, otherwise they won't germinate. You might be thinking they're not viable, but in fact you haven't given them the right conditions in order to germinate. So this is what might happen afterwards. So here are the lettuce seeds that have started to germinate. That tells me that that pack of seed or whatever I had is still viable, still alive. But you could also, if you wanted to, very carefully, perhaps with tweezers, pick these up and pop them into a punnet in order to continue to grow. If you ever grown sprouts like mung beans or alfalfa sprouts, that's basically what you're doing. But here we want them to develop into the full plant. So that's an easier way of seeing if your seeds are viable rather than putting them into the soil and waiting for them to grow. If you don't have seeds and you're wondering where to get them from, can I recommend any of these 3 places? And they all do sell online. Eden Seeds, Lost Seed, and the Seed Collection. The range of seeds is fantastic, and they'll often have descriptions of what they are and a history of the seed and so on. But what's important about them is that most of them will be what we call open pollinated or heirloom or non-hybrid types of seeds. Also not genetically modified either. No chemical treatments, because sometimes you find that with seeds as well, with the big seed makers. These ones won't be. So they're as natural as can be, and that's what you want in your garden. What's important that they're non-hybridized. So I noticed someone did put up a question much earlier saying, can I grow tomatoes from a tomato that you've just eaten? Well, yes and no. You might grow it, but it might not grow into a variety that's like the tomato you ate. And this happened to me, a classic case last year. My son went camping and someone had left a potted tomato at the campsite. So they were eating the tomatoes. They're absolutely delicious. So he brought me home some tomatoes. I saved the seed, and then the following year, which was last season, I planted them. The resulting tomato, they all grew and everything, but the tomato was nothing like what he had eaten. It was completely different. So I said the reason for that, it must have been someone had got a tomato plant and planted it, but the original seed from that must have been hybridized, which just means it has a different mother and a different father, and coming together, you've got characteristics of the mother and the father tomato plant into this little baby plant, and that's what people were wanting. But when you go to save the seed from that, it will revert to either the mother or the father plant to start with. So answering that question that people had, you may not be able to grow tomatoes from tomato seed that were like the tomato that you ate. But if you go to any of these places, they are generally non-hybridized seed, or they'll tell you if they are hybridized, which means you can't save the seed for them the following year. Okay, so I'm going to just wrap up with some general tips, and then we'll have a look at some questions. Just to recap, if you're going to use any plastic pots, make sure that you clean them and sterilize before you start. The right seeds for the right time of the year. And if it's not the right time of the year, you may need to fool the seeds into thinking it is the right time of the year, generally by making things a little bit warmer. That is altering the soil temperature. That's really, really critical. Always start with moistened soil before you sow, and keep that soil moist until germination happens, except for, remember those large seeds, the beans, the peas, the sweet corn. They tend to rot if you keep watering them before they've germinated. The planting depth is usually 1 to 2 times as deep as the seed is wide. No deeper than that really, because otherwise the plant hasn't got the energy to push through. It's used up all that energy in germinating. Now it needs the sun to transfer some energy. We need adequate light, sunlight for strong growth once germination occurs. Fertilise regularly when they're in pots and punnets, just to keep them growing. But remember, it has to be a weakened solution of whatever fertiliser you're using. This is a tip that I haven't mentioned before. Plant a few more than you think you're going to need, because there might be disasters along the way, or they might get eaten. At least you've got some backups, and you don't have to wait several weeks to get those backups or get new seeds happening if you've got backups there. And if you find you don't need them, there will always be people who are happy to take seedlings off your hands. If you're worried about plants having transplant shock, use those biodegradable pots. There's 2 or 3 different methods of doing that I've shown you, that you plant the whole pot into the ground. And lastly, most importantly, be patient, okay? Particularly when I talk about seeds with kids, if they're used to planting things in 2 dimensions, that is on online games, they expect things to happen instantly. Or nature's not like that. And it's, as at the moment we're being forced to slow down and really take things easy, get you in tune with your own garden as well. Okay, lots of information on my website, but I'm going to start taking questions now, Lisa.
Yes, okay. We have a few here. So one here is asking, do you need to keep your seeds in the fridge or store them in a box?
Look, ideally, in fact, in the crisper section of the fridge, ideally, if you've got space, wherever you keep them, make sure that the temperature doesn't fluctuate, because that'll kill the seed a lot more quickly than what it ought to. So I keep them in a folder, in fact, in a cupboard on the south side of the house. So it doesn't get any direct sunlight on that cupboard, so the temperature doesn't go up and down. Whatever you do, don't keep them in the shed, okay? Don't keep them in the garden shed, because it's not going to be insulated. Your temperatures fluctuate. Your seeds won't remain as viable as long. Now, last year I did I tried something and it works. My bean seeds that I kept from last year's crop, I'd had problems in years past where little weevils come in or little beetles and they eat them from the inside out. So I read somewhere to put them in the freezer. And I thought, oh God, when I go to plant them, do I need to defrost them or not? Anyway, I planted them straight from the freezer and they came up beautifully. So the freezer for beans worked well. But the rest, yes, you know, at about 4 degrees Celsius is ideal. But as long as you don't get temperature fluctuations happening, then your seeds should be viable for several years, depending on the seed.
Okay. Can you plant root veggies and large seeds in the toilet roll punnets and then put the whole punnet into the ground when you plant them out?
Yeah, large seeds definitely. Carrots, look, depends on how many toilet rolls you've got. You absolutely you could, but if you're running out of toilet rolls, cut the toilet rolls into halves or thirds or something, because you know the large seeds, for example, you might only want 2 pumpkin plants, but 2 carrots is just not enough carrots. Get what I mean? You're going to have to grow a lot of or keep a lot of toilet rolls in order to get a decent crop of carrots happening. Whereas you might only need 1 or 2 pumpkin plants or 1 or 2 tomatoes. So that's why I don't tend to grow the root vegetables, simply because I need a lot more of them in those biodegradable pots. You certainly can, but you're going to need a lot of them.
Do your little seedlings need to have sunshine from outside, or can it be through a window when you're germinating and growing them on?
Yeah, germination, remember they don't need sun, it's later on. Look, it can be through a window because in effect mine are in a greenhouse, I suppose, with plastic there, so the sun's not directly hitting them directly and it's still enough. Just be careful if the window gets too hot though in summertime. Now it wouldn't, but later on it might. So yeah, try doing that. You just want to avoid those elongated stems. You'll see that they will move towards the light, turn them around so that they just keep as upright as possible.
Speaking of the elongated stems, we've had a couple of questions about that where people have had them seedlings emerge and grow quite long. Is there anything that they can do, say, to plant them deeply or to try and recover those seedlings?
Yeah, a lot of them can be planted more deeply, but before you plant them, they do need to start to grow, you know, at least another set of leaves or something, and they just might not have the strength of the stem to hold up those leaves. You're probably better off starting again and just making sure as soon as you see germination that we get some sunlight to them.
Do you recommend testing temperature with a thermometer?
Yeah, if you're going to put them in the ground, yeah, definitely. If you've got a thermometer, a soil thermometer,
yes, you
can buy them quite inexpensively, and they're a handy tool. Not absolutely necessary, but they're a handy tool. Sorry, I forgot to mention, but in one of the slides I talked about what to grow when. There is a website called Garden8, so garden with ATE after it.com, and that is a fantastic resource about what to plant at different times of the year. And what Garden8 will do, it'll ask you where you live, and you say Australia, and then ask you what zone do you live in. You try to type in Melbourne, it doesn't recognise it. Melbourne is considered a temperate zone, as distinct to say Ballarat or Tasmania, which is cold. We'd be considered temperate. So that will tell you, you know, at the start of August, it's a great time to be doing such and such and such. Of course, you're going to have microclimates within your own garden, but it is a really good general rule of thumb. And perhaps with that, you might not need to get a soil temperature, soil thermometer instead. So look it up, garden8.com. It's available as an app, but otherwise you can get them to send you monthly or even fortnightly reminders of what to plant. And they tell you either plant from seed under cover, which I call indirect, or seed direct in the ground. It's really quite specific. a really valuable resource if you're still learning.
One of the viewers has been struggling to get their onions to germinate. So they're okay with spring onions and leeks, but the brown onions, red onions, not having any luck with those. Is there any tricks?
I wonder if the seed is still viable. Don't know that they last that long. I'd have to look it up. But no, they would certainly germinate just like the other ones do. And that's not usually hard to germinate as long as the seed isn't too old. I'm not sure that onion seed lasts that long. Yeah, that would be, I'd have to check, but I don't think onion seed lasts as long as, say, parsley seed or something. Yeah.
Okay. Can you use compost to grow seeds in punnets?
Not to germinate them, but later on, yes. If you're potting them up, you can put them into some compost. Now, compost isn't a long-term solution, only because as you water it, all the compost clumps, they'll sort of settle and you won't get the oxygen. So compost mixed with something else would be better. Coir would be good. But for a short term, yeah, in compost is good, if you've got good compost, of course.
One person has a fungus forming in their mini greenhouse.
Try the chamomile tea.
Yes.
Okay, try that. So try watering your seedlings with that, and make sure perhaps during the day that you allow there to be air circulation.
Great.
Yeah.
Apart from the blockers that you used to create the soil blocks to plant the seeds into, are there any other uses for worm castings with seed sowing or growing seedlings?
Oh, look, you can certainly steep some of the worm castings in water and use them as a fertilizer. Apart from that, not really, but you certainly use it as a fertilizer as such. And worm castings, in fact, steeped in water is better than the liquid that leaches out of the worm farm or the worm tea. So if you've got worm castings, you could use it that way. Just steep them in some water and then just use the liquid from that as a fertilizer.
Okay. The mini greenhouses, like the one that you had in your photos, what's the location to put them in to, I guess, get the maximum sunlight, or the time of day that's best to get the sunlight for the seedlings?
Look, I reckon morning sun, and I'm really lucky that I've got it's under the eaves and it gets morning sunshine. Afternoon sun is not as good because plants respond, or they wake up when there's sunshine there. So if they're in shade all day and then they get afternoon sun, well, in wintertime it might not be long enough afternoon sun, but also as the daylight hours get longer, that afternoon sun is going to get a lot fiercer. And so the plant's been asleep all day or dormant, let's say, and then it gets woken up by this blast of really hot sunshine. So morning sun, I reckon, would be ideal. So facing east or northeast, let's say, if you've got that sort of situation.
Okay. Just sifting through some here, some comments. Okay, we've got a question here about the Dandenong Ranges being considered a cool climate. I guess that's for the gardenate. And also up around Warburton, I guess, would be about the same as well.
Yeah, no, you're right, actually, too. Sometimes I go up to Whittlesea, and Whittlesea is fine, but just beyond Whittlesea, it's considered, cold or cool temperate, yeah. So you're adding possibly a month beyond what we're getting in Melbourne in terms of getting your soil temperatures and nighttime temperatures, compatible. Yeah. No, good point about that. Sorry, I forgot who I was talking to.
There's a question around punnets where some seeds have germinated and some haven't. Is there anything that you can do to potentially germinate the seeds that didn't come up, or they would be considered to be not viable?
Yeah, if they haven't germinated within 2 or 3 days of the other ones and the conditions are all okay, then yeah, they're probably not viable. You rarely get 100% what's called strike rate in these sorts of things, and often seed packets in good ones will say 70% will germinate. They're even telling you we're not expecting a whole lot of them to germinate.
Do you need to worry about the soil pH when germinating your seeds?
Look, you probably want to keep it as neutral as possible. That's why if you're going into straight compost, might be a little bit acidic. I've never known it to be an issue, but yeah, if it's wildly acidic or really, really alkaline, yeah, that will probably affect things too. Yeah.
Okay. In regards to the questions, we might just leave the rest there for now. We're having another session on, or we're looking to have another session on actually planting your spring veggies in the coming weeks. So we'll be able to answer some more around when you're actually putting your seeds that you've grown the seedlings of and putting those seedlings into the ground. We'll be able to answer some more of those types of questions a little bit later. If there's any seeds that you didn't, any questions that you didn't get a chance to have answered tonight, you can ask them on the Gardens for Harvest Facebook page, and I'll send through the link to that. If you're unfamiliar with where to find that, I'll send the link with the email that I send to you tomorrow. So any unanswered questions from tonight, you can ask them on there, and we'll be able to have those answered for you. But for now, thank you very much, Maria, for your presentation tonight. Everyone will have something to take away, and it's a nice weekend coming up so that we can all get into the garden.
Absolutely, yeah. Spring is in the air, that's for sure.
It is. So thank you everyone for watching tonight. As I mentioned, I'll send through an email tomorrow with the link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a bunch of other information on upcoming workshops that are offered in our area. And I'll include some of the other links like our Facebook page and a link to the Garden8 page and things like that. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you all again very soon. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.